Well, first of all, thank you very much indeed for inviting me here today. It is a real privilege and pleasure to be here. A bit of background of where this comes from. Several years ago, the Maritime Museum at Greenwich put out a call for papers inviting new perspectives on the First World War at sea. And for over a decade, I've been working with French colleagues on various naval historical issues. And I thought it might be an interesting exercise to examine how the British and French naval forces cooperated at the Dardanelles throughout 1915. In that regard, this is very much an academic paper, and therefore it has very much an academic approach. And as an academic paper, what we seek to do is fill gaps in the historiography or answer questions that remain open in the historiography. And the approach we had was that I worked on the British archives, and my French colleagues, Jean de Préneuf, the University of Lille, Charles de Gaulle, and Dr Thomas Vaisset of the Service Historique de la Défense worked on the French side. And then we came together to construct the narrative. And that's largely the background to this. So we presented the paper at conference at Greenwich, and then after several peer review processes, it was finally published in the British Journal of Military History. So this is, as I say, very much an academic approach to the subject, so I hope that it doesn't come across as being too dense. It does mean that for the purposes of delivering the paper, I have to read it very much, which is not my style at all. Because it's the only way of conveying what is actually in the archives, what various naval officers were saying to one another and to others involved in what was going on. At least there is one fundamental difference, even if it is not my style. I at least have a full room, which is not typically true of most of my lectures at university. So, to begin, the First World War was not the first time that France and Britain had experience working together in naval coalition. The Crimean War of 1854 to 56, the Second Opium War of 1856 to 60, and at Alexandria in 1882 were examples, though not very happy ones. However, these were long distant in the memory to the men of 1914, and the fact remained that when Britain and France entered the war in 1914, they did so with no practical experience of collaborative operations together. Outside of the main Western Front theatre, the Dardanelles was the first major combined operational deployment of the war. Paul Halpern stated that at the Dardanelles, relations between the British and French, to a large extent, depended upon the personalities of the respective admirals. There seems little doubt that this is true. That much was confirmed by Admiral Weems when reflecting on the operation in a letter to Admiral John de Robeck in February 1916. However, many other factors came into play that determined relations between the Allies in the Dardanelles operation, and these factors will be discussed in what follows. The rationale for this study, and this is the academic bit, the rationale for this study rests on three factors. First, the subject of the Dardanelles operation has largely been covered at the high Grant strategic level to the neglect of lower operational level when considering inter-allied relationships, and monographs focus on top-rank officers, much to the neglect of their subordinates. Second, because of recent scholarship into the largely neglected subject of naval coalition warfare, it is possible to ask context-specific questions on the subject toward discovering the factors that affected success or failure. Thirdly, within the historiography of the First World War, recent scholarship has illustrated and emphasized the critical role of Allied cooperation across all aspects of the war. Elizabeth Greenaw, in her book Victory Through Coalition, argues persuasively that Allied cooperation was the bedrock of victory. She explains, without a willingness, however focused, lost my place, sorry, to put aside past enmities, work in cooperative ways, submerge differences, to create an efficient machinery of alliance, the powerful threat represented by the Central Powers, and especially Germany, could not be beaten. It is an opinion shared by William Philpott in his book, Attrition, Fighting the First World War. Nevertheless, it is clear, as Greenor and Philpott demonstrate, that the road to such effective cooperation was littered with painful and costly lessons. In this regard, the Dardanelles offers an insight into early war Anglo-French cooperation, particularly as it falls outside the detailed scrutiny of the work of Greenor and Philpott. There is little doubt that the fundamental causes of the disaster must lie at the highest level, with failure among the Allies to coordinate their military and political aims, many of which were in direct conflict. A particularly important issue to consider is that, unlike today, when states are willing to accept some degree of surrender of sovereignty, this was not so at the Dardanelles in 1915. The men of 1915 were products of the 19th century, and to them, national prestige, national interest, and personal honour mattered, and mattered a lot. Also, professional pride, now just as then, was fundamentally crucial. What this paper will demonstrate is that whilst overtly cordial, relations between British and French officers were marked by deep-rooted antipathy and prejudice. Antipathy and prejudice grew out of national prestige and interest and permeated personal honour. On another related matter, Bruce Ellerman and Sarah Payne, in their groundbreaking work on naval coalition warfare, identified several factors for success: decision-making, communication, unity of interest, equality of partnership, interoperability, and burden sharing. These factors will be examined in this paper within the context of the Dardanelles operation to ascertain to what degree these factors were relevant to the failure of the operation, at least at sea. On the eve of the outbreak of war in 1914, the relationship between the Marine Nationale and the Royal Navy was unequal and unbalanced. The Marine Nationale believed it enjoyed a special relationship with its Entente partner. French politicians and naval officers were proud of the reforms the Marine Nationale had undertaken from 1906 that had renewed political and professional confidence. Despite this, officers of the Marine Nationale recognised their services' inferiority to the fleets of the Triple Alliance and consequently recognised their reliance on the Royal Navy. With the exception of a few individuals, that is, of French leading admirals, they were among the most enthusiastic supporters of the Entente, and all but a few wished to see the Entente become a formal alliance. The French recognised the undeniable global superiority of the Royal Navy and recognised too that the Royal Navy had exceptional technological and operational capability. The naval agreement of 1912 relieved the French of the possibility of facing the German fleet in northern waters, whilst encouraging the view within the ranks of the Marine Nationale that, by accepting responsibility for the Mediterranean, the Royal Navy was in need of its support. Unfortunately, far from being an attribution of British confidence in the Marine Nationale, British attitudes to the Mediterranean were complicated. On the one hand, former First Lord Admiral Fisher encouraged Churchill to view the Mediterranean as a dangerous submarine-infested lake, well left to the French. After all, Fisher argued, what is the use of the French Entente if you don't use it? On the other hand, despite extreme financial and strategic constraints, Churchill attempted to maintain a substantial British presence in the Mediterranean in support of British interests. In either case, and contrary to French perceptions, there was no view that considered the Marine Nationale either capable or desirable an instrument to defend British Mediterranean interests. On the 22nd of June 1914, for example, the Marine Nationale requested that Admiral Henry Jackson, Chief of the Admiralty War Staff, exchange secret codes to enable their respective navies to practice wireless telegraphy communication in the Mediterranean in advance of any crisis with the Triple Alliance powers. To the French, such an agreement seems logical, given that such arrangements had been put in place in the Channel since the agreements of February 1913. Jackson, in a response to the French naval attaché Sanson, refused, citing a lack of formal alliance. This reflected Admiralty policy. This lack of cooperation meant that, by the war's outbreak in the Mediterranean theatre, there was a lack of common tactics and signals, and the French Mediterranean commander, Vice Admiral Bouet de la Perrière, had never even met his British counterpart. Nor indeed had Bouet de la Perrière received any instructions from Paris about how to organise collaboration with the British. To French admirals, the arrangements made under the Convention of 6 August 1914 were an indication that the British had full confidence in their capability. After all, Vice Admiral Bouet de la Perrière was designated C&C of all naval forces Mediterranean, and the French were designated to protect all British trade through that sea. French officers were grateful for the fact that Malta had been provided as a major logistic base for the French fleet from the outset of the war. All indications were, as far as the French officers were concerned, that the Royal Navy regarded the Marine Nationale as an equal, and this was of great importance to the French. Important too that the British stick to the agreement of 6 August, which placed the French in overall command. Indeed, the subordination of the Royal Navy in the Mediterranean to French command was emphasised by an Admiralty order of 18th August that placed Admiral Carden as Chief Naval Officer at Malta, with Admiral Trowbridge C&C at sea, all under the French C&C Mediterranean. Unfortunately, whatever the impressions or assumptions of French officers at this time as to British tactical and technological superiority and their belief in equality, they were to be disabused by the events surrounding the Dardanelles. As C&C Mediterranean, La Perrière adhered strictly to the 6th August agreement, although, focused as he was on operational matters, he failed to take into account the political effect of the balance of forces between the Allies as they developed at the Dardanelles and the effect that this would have. The escape of Goeben and Breslau significantly changed the balance of naval forces in the Mediterranean, and so the French were quite happy for a Royal Navy squadron off the Dardanelles to watch for these ships. This made sense, as the Marine Nationale had to concentrate its efforts on covering the Otranto Straits, and Goeben alone was more powerful than any French ship available. La Perrière regarded Carden's squadron as independent, but subordinate to his command. The matter was complicated by the fact that from September there were 2 French battleships under Rear Admiral Pratt. Now, Pratt's a very important figure in this, who we'll come to later, operating with Carden's force, and Pratt, as shall be seen below, was to prove problematic from the French point of view. La Perrière, who was reluctant to send more French ships to enhance the Dardanelles blockade, continued to give priority to the Otranto Straits. In November, La Perrière and the Ministry of Marine declined a British offer because of the continuing Goeben threat to place the French in command of the blockade. Although La Perrière advised his Minister of Marine, Victor Augenier, of his willingness to assist his subordinate, albeit with an interesting caveat. He said, "I will always try to provide any help to Admiral Carden he may ask for when we are able to do so." And that final caveat is terrifically important in how much of this plays out. Letters sent by Rear Admiral Limpus and Rear Admiral Sidney Fremantle in early 1915 to fellow Royal Navy officers indicated that it was clear that Royal Navy officers had little confidence in French strategy planning and operations in the Mediterranean generally. By far the most important factor that generated operational frictions from the outset was that as far as the British were concerned, the Royal Navy simply did not require the assistance of the Marine Nationale. And this view went to the very top. At the outset, Churchill had informed Sir Edward Grey that he had invited French involvement only, quote, out of loyalty and politeness. And he believed himself that the French had only gone along to ensure their regional interests were upheld. Although it is true that French participation was desired insofar as providing what the British initially lacked, i.e. small cruisers, destroyers, seaplanes and submarines, it is significant that the French were not included in the original planning at the Dardanelles, and subsequently when they were detailed off with their own orders. Carden, for example, stated to de Robeck with some resignation and in recognition of the political aspects at the time of the initial planning, "We must let the French take a hand in the opening part." Admiral Keyes, in a letter to his wife in March 1915, noted what he put as British generosity, insofar as, and again I quote, "We gave the French admiral a day with his squadron inside, supporting Agamemnon and Lord Nelson, who bombarded the forts at long range." But French participation was generally not received with any enthusiasm. Rear Admiral Fremantle, C&C 3rd Division, stated, "It might, I suppose, be done using French battleships to take a turn bombarding, but I do not care much for the prospect of having a Frenchman under me in an operation where one might require to give a good many orders by signal," which is an interesting comment given that British lack of cooperation was partly a problem in terms of signalling between the various naval forces. Inevitably, grand strategic imperial rivalries re-emerged, especially French sensitivities over Syria, and considerable efforts were made to ensure that a final division of responsibilities was agreed. On 20th December 1914, a memorandum devoted to that issue was sent by the General Staff of the French Navy to the Admiralty. This very interesting document shows that for the first time the Marine Nationale agreed to make an exception to the French command for the entire Mediterranean Sea, as was established in August 1914. The memorandum proposed to give independence to the British in Egypt and the Red Sea in exchange of the recognition of France's preeminent role in the Dardanelles and, important, in front of the Syrian coast, which was considered the core of French interests in the area. But the Marine Nationale's unrealistic position was quickly pointed out by the British, a want of resources. And finally, a compromise was found by which the French government had to accept British claims. The attack on the Dardanelles was recognised as being, quote, distinct, with a French squadron under Carden's command independent of La Perrière. Despite the fact that geopolitical issues had been more or less resolved, at least officially, there were several issues that undermined cooperation in theatre. The first issue on the British side was their failure to keep French officers informed at all levels. Second was the general attitude of British officers to the French that resulted in the latter being relegated to subsidiary duties. The third was the failure of the attack on 18th March 1915. On the French side was an instance of making grand strategic claims in the Levant that their naval capability and contribution did not match. Second were repeated claims for operational responsibilities the Marine Nationale was unable to undertake. There is no doubt that these issues affected the conduct of the Dardanelles campaign and that the relative imbalance of power affected the mindset and approach of British and personnel, respectively. Interpersonal relations and subjective assessments between French and British officers reflected the unequal share of burdens negotiated in the Eastern Mediterranean Sea. At first sight, cordiality appeared to be the order of the day, especially when matters were unofficial. From British sailors from HMS Cornwallis, chatting with and giving sugar to French troops, for example, and French troops helping Midshipman Forbes recover his trophy, which, by the way, was part of a Turkish fort. On the face of it, matters appear to have been convivial between the Allies. At senior levels within theatre, matters were more complex. Keyes recorded how, en route to the Dardanelles, he played cards with several nice French naval officers. Keyes also recorded exchanges for dinner, as do other British officers. Vice Admiral McClintock of HMS Lord Nelson recorded a very happy dinner at which they entertained Le Perrier, the retired Vice Admiral Fournier, and Captain de la Roche-Calandron, commander of the battleship République. He recorded that all went splendidly, although he makes certain humorous notes about 4 other French officers who did not speak, were fat and of a certain age, and lunch for them was no laughing matter. They tucked their napkins under their chins, squared their elbows, and cleared for action. Keyes, after one dinner on board Gaulois on 9 September 1915, recorded, "This visit has been a great success. The French C&C, La Perrier, never liked us before. Always rather resented our independence, etc. But now he is our friend forever. He and my Admiral de Robeck, got on splendidly." Admiral Weems, commander at Mudros Harbour, wrote to de Robeck, "The French C&C left here this evening amidst an interchange of cordial signals, which I think truly reflected the feelings on both sides. He spoke of you in the most warm and cordial terms and begged me to send you back his best wishes." Such recollections are not untypical, but some reflection is required. For example, Weems' comments are indicative of his known tact, for he disliked the French intensely. As for Keyes, he is either very naive in believing in such a Damascene conversion on Le Perrier's part, or he was very ignorant of the protocol of the French Naval Officer Corps that permits no discordant discussion at dinner. By this point in the operation, French honour had been damaged too much to accept that matters were so cordial behind the scenes. Indeed, exchanges were not always so cordial. Admiral Fremantle, for example, informed de Robeck of his irritation of Rear Admiral Juarez, who on visiting HMS Hibernia rudely demanded salad and eggs for the officers' table. On the part of the French, records indicate a less cordial scene. Lieutenant Louis Venin explained in a letter to his wife that British officers, although considered loyal, professional, and individually gallant, were also considered distant and chauvinistic. By May 1915, on board Gaulois, Medical Officer Laurent Moreau and the commander of the ship, Captain Morache, recorded that, although outwardly matters appeared cordial, there was little professional or personal contact between French and British officers, with each remaining within their own community, doing little to develop professional or personal contacts. Later, at Mudros, a decision was made by French officers, for example, to discontinue the normal official exchanges. By October 1915, Dr Jean de Préneuf was reporting to the Department of the Navy that British officers were adopting a superficially cordial attitude to French officers. Cordiality, superficial or otherwise, was certainly not evident in private communications between officers of the same side. The view held by British officers was not one driven wholly by xenophobic national views. Their view of the French poilu was one of admiration, although this admiration was not extended to French black colonial troops. In reciprocation, French naval officers such as Commandant Morache of Gaulois had a dim view of British troops, who they regarded as unprofessional, a view that Commodore Amédée van Gavert extended to the British conduct of the land campaign. The most general problem was Royal Navy officers holding a view of the Marine Nationale that was predicated upon a general sense of superiority, which unfortunately fed through to operational problems. It was an attitude that permeated from the top down to junior officer ranks. At the senior level, Admiral Olympus made the following comment: "Gallant, spirited, and charming as our French allies are, they are 25 years behind us in hard, practical, dogged sea patrol work. They will never learn in a year in how to do it." Lieutenant Thomas Haldane, serving aboard HMS Doris en route to the Dardanelles, recorded with a sense of casual superiority, quote, "We met the French battleship Saint Louis. She was trying to destroy a pier by gunfire, but could not hit it. And so we opened fire and pretty well destroyed it with about 10 rounds." Rear Admiral Rosalind Weems was, according to Julian Corbett in his official history, the ideal choice for Commandant Mudros, given his exceptional experience and success in working with the French. In reality, Weems' view was almost wholly negative. To his wife, he wrote on 3rd March on assuming command, "The French, with whom I am again, alas, connected, are hopeless and awful, and of course full of promises which are never performed." And he followed up on another occasion where he noted to his wife, "Alas, from seeing the French working side by side with our sailors, one's impressions formed previously from naval experience are only confirmed. They appear to be quite without method or organisation and are dreadfully subject to nerves, although individually brave and dashing." In truth, there is no shortage of evidence praising the officers and men of the Marine Nationale for examples of individual gallantry or seamanship. Weems' attitude to officers of the Marine Nationale as an organisation in general, in contrast to the high esteem in which he held the French army, was typical amongst British naval officers. As an example of this, he wrote to his wife, talking of General Damad, "He's the only Frenchman I have come across in the last 8 months who seems capable of coming to a decision of or on an initiative. If he is the type of French soldier, certainly they surpass their naval comrades." He got away with these views because, as Keyes recorded, "No one could possibly be better, so tactful with our soldiers and with the French." Indeed, he was tactful enough to avoid the displeasure of French naval officers that would be later heaped on their British allies. Perhaps this is why Corbett considered him most suitable for that role. In any case, papers show that although French officers recognized Weems' skills, they complained that although he could speak French, he deliberately conversed with them in English, which they took as a deliberate slight on his part. To some degree, British perceptions were mirrored by the French themselves. French officers knew that the force they sent to the Dardanelles comprised old battleships. They were worried about the technical limits of the Marine Nationale in general compared to the Royal Navy, and they were aware that British crews were more disciplined than their French counterparts. They were particularly concerned that no incident should occur that would tarnish the image of the Marine Nationale before their British ally. Nevertheless, French disillusionment set in early with the arrival at the Dardanelles in November of additional French warships, increasing the French force under Pratt to battleships Gaulois, Suffren, Saint-Louis and Verité, including 6 destroyers and 3 submarines. This exposed more French officers to first-hand experience of the Royal Navy at work and its limitations. Lieutenant Vernin explained to his wife that, and well, you see, there's nothing like to be next to others, to compare and judge by yourself. By seeing closely the British Navy, many of my illusions are dispelling. Well, we don't have it all to suffer from comparison with it. I don't want to say more by letter, but I shall not hide this from you, that I am glad to have a closer look at these self-imagined demigods. The British complex of superiority, mixed with certitude not to need major operational help from a less effective French fleet, paved way to make the French excluded from intelligence and operational planning. Very early indications were that the British were acting autonomously and did not keep Lapeyre informed. What he regarded initially as a lack of professional courtesy became the germ of what became an increasingly fractious dispute as events developed. From a situation the French regarded as one of mutual confidence and respect, began a process leading to disappointment, disillusionment and bitterness. Failure to keep French command at all levels informed of decisions made by Royal Navy officers undermined the French notion that officers of the Royal Navy regarded French officers in the Marine Nationale as equals. It was clear that the British planned and undertook operations without reference to the French at all levels. For example, Lapeyre only discovered preparations undertaken from January 1915 because Pratt, his man on the spot, had requested logistic supplies from Bizerta. That Carden was planning an operation without referring to Lapeyre was bad enough. That Pratt should later disclose to Lapeyre that he had been told by Carden not to inform Lapeyre was even worse. This indifference to French sensitivities continued into the campaign. On 25th May 1915, following a visit to Malta, Rear Admiral Cecil Thursby, commander of the 2nd Squadron at the Dardanelles, informed de Robeck, now C&C Dardanelles, that I called on the French C&C. He is a decent old chap, but I think he feels rather left out in the cold, as operations presently take place in his command without his knowledge. For example, the bombardment of Smyrna. As for the Smyrna bombardment itself, Lapeyre was left to discover events through Reuters, though when he asked for information from de Robeck, he admitted that the latter disclosed the information very gallantly. British officers, for their part, only confirmed the opinion of French officers by maintaining their sense of superiority and for persisting, in the view of the French, in making poor tactical and strategic decisions. These perceptions were derived from experience. It is perhaps Dartige de Fournay who best illustrates this experience of French officers when working with the British. De Fournay, successor to Bouet de Lapeyre as C&C Mediterranean from October 1915, was a firm supporter of the Entente and Alliance. He also sincerely admired the Royal Navy. After his first meeting with de Robeck and other senior British officers, he reported to his minister Ingenieur that he was certain that the British sincerely desired to develop operational cooperation and integration and include French naval forces far more in their pursuit of the campaign. He had concluded his report definitively. History is full of disagreements which paralysed so many coalitions and so often created opposition between generals and admirals. I am convinced there will be nothing like that at the Dardanelles. only 1 month later, his state of mind was now dominated by bitterness for not being associated or even informed about operations planned by the British. He denounced not only an unfair ally, but also an incompetent one, as he now wrote to the French Minister of Marine. Unfortunately, it is obvious that the Marine Nationale is considered here as a kind of reserve force, only dedicated to support foreign, i.e. British, operations. We're going to be excluded from their genesis and their direction till the day when the Marine Nationale will have to compensate for British mistakes. She won't be responsible for these errors, but she will have to support their consequences. I don't talk about success because there are tiny opportunities for us to be put in a position to get it. And, in general, to honour this ally for a success is unusual, even if you owe it to him. The British trend to provide little operational and tactical information to the French and to appoint them only for secondary tasks was enhanced by the predominance of British telegraphic communications, which always remained a major problem for the Marine Nationale. The French were wholly dependent on the British for communications and intelligence, such that when in February 1915, Leperrier complained to his Minister of Marine that when he had needed to communicate with French naval forces in the Aegean, he had to use British systems and codes, and only British officers had the codes, which meant that his communications to his subordinates were known first and in full to the British. Within Theatre 2, the British were determined to control communications, especially wireless telegraphy. The operational orders, which were written, of course, by the British, contained detailed arrangements for signals by wireless telegraphy, flag and searchlight, especially for spotting and directing fire. For the initial bombardments, Pratt's ship Suffren had 4 Royal Navy signals ratings seconded to ensure the efficient interpretation of signals. Staff officers too were exchanged to facilitate effective communication. Nevertheless, despite these sensible arrangements, Vice Admiral Ernst Nicole, commander of the French Dardanelles squadron from April to September 1915, recorded that de Robeck, although constantly courteous, refused to share information with him or integrate French forces within Royal Navy operations, preferring instead to delegate the Marine Nationale to secondary tasks. Captain Van Gavere, in command of Charlemagne, recorded that although relations with Royal Navy officers were not bad, communication was very limited, and he complained that he was not properly informed by his British counterparts regarding forthcoming operations. He noted that even as late as May 1915, there were no French officers detached to work with British Army batteries, and that French ships were not provided the codes for British Army batteries, which meant that he had to ask HMS Agamemnon to decode messages. Even in theatre, a fundamental problem for the French was that the British were determined to control communications, and despite the fact that codes were distributed in orders and personnel exchange, communications were problematic. The then Lieutenant Commander Somerville, the officer responsible for wireless telegraphy at the Dardanelles, recorded in his diary that he had constant problems controlling its use by airmen, soldiers, but especially the French. It was a persistent problem that was referred, in fact, to the highest levels. Wireless telegraphy had 2 distinct problems. The first was too much traffic caused confusion. The second was lack of security. For Somerville, French wireless telegraphy sets were A1, as he called them, but at crucial times they failed, causing him great stress. However, he was constantly having to intervene to curtail its use. On one occasion, the French proposed using it ashore to improve communications, but Somerville's response that it would really hash up everything. Line is, must be stopped at all costs. On another occasion, when the need was to maintain security as the land forces were mobilizing for the April landings, he recorded with some irritation and humour, Operations ordered to commence and transports started to pour out of the harbour for their rendezvous. I had to go ashore and seal up the French wireless telegraphy station. Its naval commander was furious, but the operators didn't seem to mind very much. For the French, this was all a source of considerable frustration and a problem never really solved for all the practical measures put into place. The failure of the 18th March bombardment did much to undermine the image of the Royal Navy in the opinion of French officers, and it was a major turning point from which the reputation of the Royal Navy and its senior officers did not recover in French eyes. The attack was not supported at the most senior levels of French command in any event. The loss of professional respect from French naval officers to their Royal Navy counterparts, especially when seen in conjunction with the failure to communicate openly, meant increasingly that French officers, with the exception of Pratt, regarded the Royal Navy with growing contempt for what they regarded as arrogance and incompetence. According to Lieutenant Vaisset, the British had, I quote, "The British had made an unforgivable mistake not to act in August 1914 by not following the Goeben when it entered the Dardanelles. In October, in November, in December, in January, it was still easy to enter the strait because the Turkish were not on their guard and they didn't believe it was possible. In February, it was still possible forcing through. But in March, it was too late, especially after the attack of March 18th, so badly, which warned the Turks." The commander of Gaulois was harsher, probably because his ship was severely damaged during the attack. He said, from the naval point of view, especially, the heaviest faults have been done, and for that he blamed the British. This state of mind was very common amongst French naval officers serving in the Dardanelles. It was shared in Paris. In private, members of the French Council of Ministers was also severely critical of the Royal Navy's inability to manage the operation. Operational cooperation was fraught with difficulty. The reality was that the Allies did not have today what would be regarded as standard operating procedures. And this meant they went about operations in their own way, often to the frustration and irritation of one another. The Royal Navy had always operated with maximum sea time, and one of the most common complaints from Royal Navy officers was that the French were always in port. As Weems complained, as regards berthing of ships at Madras, double berthing doesn't help me a bit as far as men of war are concerned. It is a case of depth of water, and the Frenchmen take up all the billets. They really are the limit, and it makes me mad. And our ships out for such a long period, and then no room for them when they want to come in. He recorded with even greater frustration. They, the French, do little or no work and only take up valuable space and time. They are tiresome, and I am beginning to look upon them with feelings far from amicable. French naval forces were also reliant upon the British for logistics support in theatre to a huge extent. Vaisset, who I've mentioned before, this chap here, in command of destroyer Sab, was particularly impressed by the efficiency of the administration at Malta and the ability of British logistics operations to bring in personnel, ships and supplies into the theatre of operations. Nevertheless, for the British, this dependency was a source of irritation. Weems, C&C Madras, and also responsible for logistics in theatre, recorded, they, i.e. the French, not only do nothing, but they actually want everything. And he followed up on another occasion when he railed to his wife in a letter, "Imagine my feelings this morning. There appears on the scene a French general who informs me he is the precursor of the French army, who has apparently been told that I will supply them with all they need. Truly the ways of those in authority is beyond thought. The French are quite enough." At times, these small issues resulted in petty breakdowns of cooperation. Captain Edward Unwin VC, when securing the use of River Clyde, discovered she had aboard 100 tons of French supplies. Despite the approval of the French admiral to remove them, the local French officer so disapproved of Unwin's requisition that he refused to allow his men to help the unloading, which Unwin and his men had to do overnight as a consequence. It was also clear that the French had to rely on British support when ships required repair in theatre, especially in an emergency. When Gallois was torpedoed and beached, it was carpenters and divers from HMS Cornwallis that repaired the damage. Similarly, when Suffren was torpedoed, British divers repaired her, with Keyes recording apparently with some satisfaction. The French admiral made most gallant signals, but they are very helpless and looked on with folded hands doing nothing, full of gratitude and admiration for the energy of their dear allies. Among British officers was a general attitude that the French, for all their individual gallantry, were not up to the job, and neither was their technology. These factors fed through to operational problems, and submarines were the most exasperating problem. In the minds of British officers, the presence of German submarines in the Mediterranean was primarily the fault of the French. Well, after all, they were in charge. As for the submarines operating at the Dardanelles, again the French were blamed for having ineffective patrols. British officers were also incredulous at the way the French operated despite the submarine menace. Somerville recorded 2 incidents that annoyed him in particular. In his diary, he recorded, "Great excitement in the forenoon when the French reported a German submarine in difficulties off Kerversdeer. All destroyers rushed to attack, but the submarine got away. It was there an hour, and the blasted Frenchmen thought it was ours. They are the limit." He later recorded that, despite the great submarine menace, as follows: "Left Madras at 4 p.m, fine hot day. Passed Henry IV, gaily steaming towards Helles at 9 knots. No escort or anything. The French really are the limit." However, French officers were similarly astonished at British attitudes to the submarine problem. French officers record the same general and persisting lack of caution on the part of the Royal Navy major surface units against mines and submarines compared to themselves. French officers regarded British modes of operation as most unprofessional and irresponsible. Admiral Nicholson in particular was singled out as responsible for the loss of HMS Majestic, in exactly the same circumstances a few days before of HMS Triumph, for failing to take account of the submarine threat. Somerville recorded that the French were similarly at fault. As he recorded in his diary, "French transport Carthage sunk by submarine off Helles. Not surprised, as she'd been there 3 days." In reality, these examples are more probably expressions of the fact that there was no solution to the submarine threat, but they also indicate considerable discordancy amongst allies. 2 further issues that irritated the British were interrelated. Firstly, a French determination to undertake as much work as possible. Secondly, a defined fact that they had insufficient resources to do so. This was particularly the case with patrols against submarines. French involvement was ostensibly to cover deficiencies in this area. However, despite French efforts, they were lacking in this regard considerably. Weems complained to de Robeck in September, "I have asked the French if they could assist me by taking their share of the island patrol, which is at present entirely run by English boats, but they say they are unable to do it." Similarly, Captain Rudolf Burmester of HMS Eurolus recorded that in pursuit of submarines near Bugram, he was, quote, "to cooperate with French patrol vessels in search of the latter area in 2 days' time. I have not been able to persuade the captain of Henry IV to move earlier. The coastline, or rather their coastline, the French coastline, which wants a large number of patrol craft to look after it, is not visited. And I have no doubt that even the French vessels on patrol spend most of their time in harbour. French concerns at the opening of the campaign that their ships were technologically inferior were borne out by the view held by British officers, notwithstanding the fact that with the exception of the Queen Elizabeth and Inflexible, the British contribution in naval vessels was decidedly second-rate. Nevertheless, Admiral Olympus recorded, "The French have no fast cruisers and their destroyers can't stand the work that ours can." Keyes recorded on 15th March 1915 that the French squadron consisted of Suffren, Gaulois, Charlemagne and Bouvet. They had done very well, but they, I mean the ships, not the personnel, can't stand much knocking about, and they are rather a cause of anxiety. Carden, when handing over to Robeck, noted, "The old-type French battleships in the squadron are unable to make good the loss of fresh water. Their coaling is very slow, and the machinery is apparently not in good condition." Conversely, after 18th March, a more critical French eye noted that in reality, French modern warships were more resilient to damage than British warships. However, for operational tasks, French mines and minesweeping were a major concern for the British. Lieutenant Commander John Godfrey, then on board HMS Euryalus, was tasked with laying French mines. He recorded the following in his diary over several days. "The mines are French and are supposed to be unsafe to handle." He noted that the French sal ammoniac plugs were unsatisfactory, i.e. they blew up prematurely. Next, he records, "The Casabianca has sunk, blown up by the first mine she laid last night. These French mines seem to be a great danger to any ship that lays them." Finally, he recorded, "I cannot say I look forward with any pleasure to laying any more of these French mines." The mine issue and the loss of Casabianca was noteworthy enough, in fact, for Keyes to relay the event to his wife. But minesweeping was a problem for both parties, but the French system added problems as far as the execution of sweeping in the Straits is concerned. And of course, minesweeping in the Straits was a very important activity. Keyes recorded that the systems differed, and the most noteworthy difference between British and French systems was that it took 5 minutes for a British minesweeper to deploy, but a French one took 30 minutes. This had consequences, and so the following deserves detailed thought. In a letter to his wife, Keyes reported the following. "The CEO of the French minesweepers, who were given a free hand of the night of the 11th March, meant to try and get above the minefield. But he decided they couldn't risk half an hour to deploy under a heavy fire stopped. And so he tried to sweep against the current. After a bit, as he was making no headway, they withdrew. So once again, we had to say we had no headway owing to a heavy fire, which caused no casualties." Which I think is as close to an accusation of cowardice as you could possibly get. Reciprocally, British mine warfare was severely criticised by the French. Le Perrier complained about the Royal Navy's material deficiencies. He reported that the British systems were less efficient than the French. The commander of the French minesweeping flotilla, Commander de Courtois, underlined the persistent inefficiency of the British operations. He said, "It seems to me there is no direction for minesweeping. Everybody operates haphazardly." In his view, cooperation was very limited because of the British. "I feel we are just born by the British and that we are considered first of all as spectators." Nevertheless, despite the experience of French sailors of the Royal Navy and the many negative impressions they formed consequently, it remained the case that they retained a complex mix of inferiority, disappointment and rivalry. Throughout the operation, French personnel were very sensitive to British opinion of them and welcomed with pride any British expressions of favour. Nevertheless, at the French equivalent of the Dardanelles Commission, Ingenieur, the French Minister of Marine at the time of the operation, spread the fault widely, but in the end came to placing blame at the feet of the Royal Navy, stating, "The British have the idea that they have the world's first navy. True, perhaps, at least formally, but they can't accept the smallest of their ships under the command of a man who is not British. On both sides, individual characters and skills played a key role. De Robeck and Pratt embody and are the focus of British and French critics alike, who emphasise their personal responsibility for the Dardanelles failure. There is something of a parallel between these two national scapegoats, but criticism is not skewed by nationality. Criticism comes equally from British and French officers. As noted before, following the 18th March failure, French officers revised their presuppositions regarding, amongst other issues, British technical, tactical and general superiority. De Robeck attracted most of the ire of French officers, with the exception of Pratt, who regarded the real culprit as Churchill. French officers focused their attacks on de Robeck's military skill, character and his utter hostility to French interests. Following his own experience, d'Artige de Fournay was led to completely reconsider of his opinion of the possibility of effective cooperation, and writing just 4 months after his favourable comments to Augenier of 2nd October 1915, he informed his boss, "Even though cooperation is strong between de Robeck and me, the differences of national character and state of mind are too great between officers of men of both nations to facilitate parallel cooperation in any area with success." Although Keyes' papers suggest that de Robeck was disinclined to pursue a further naval-only attack, de Fournay took the view that de Robeck was driven by nothing but revenge. De Robeck was, in the opinion of Captain Van Gavere, captain of Charlemagne, foolhardy, arrogant, a braggart and incompetent. Ultimately, from the French perception, it is the refusal of Royal Navy officers, de Robeck in particular, their failure to receive French advice on the conduct of the campaign that led to its eventual failure. Pratt, I'll just go back to rather astonishing picture, I have to say. Pratt is a complex figure in an assessment of a relationship with the Dardanelles. As commander of French forces, he was subordinate to Carden and then de Robeck. Nevertheless, his position carried with it both military and political burdens. Militarily, his job after supporting the British was to ensure that he protected his ships and his men from unreasonable risk. Politically, he should have ensured that French interests were represented and upheld. After several months on station, the authorities in France had concluded that he had done neither. Dubbed the Fire Eater by the British, Pratt was loved by the British. "A gallant old fellow spoiling to fight," recorded Keyes. When advised that Pratt was to be replaced, British officers recorded their views with various degrees of irritation and regret. De Robeck informed Limpus, "Private, have they told you about the future and the new formation of the squadron out here? Don't like it at all. They are sending a French VA up here, senior to Pratt, which is a great mistake. Dear old soul he is, the most loyal friend one could have, and hate anyone coming between us." It is certainly noteworthy that as a general rule, Pratt is usually celebrated within the Royal Navy, and his replacement, Vice Admiral Nicole, is celebrated within the National Marine. The decision on Augenier's part to replace Pratt had two aims. The first was to get a French admiral on the spot equal in rank to de Robeck, get the tongue right eventually, and thereby neutralise his influence. The second was to ensure French interests were represented effectively. Vice Admiral Nicole was known to be loyal to La Perriere and to be an excellent commander. French officers quickly appreciated the change in tone and appreciated too his less accommodating and passive attitude to de Robeck, in full contrast to that of Pratt. Marache noted that although he was subordinate to de Robeck, he knew how to keep his independence. Nicole's impact was noted by de Robeck somewhat spitefully. He wrote, "It is very hard to get this new French VA to do anything. He will do nothing as well as anyone. Nicole is a very different man from my dear old Pratt, who was a gallant fellow and the most loyal friend. Nicole is a man of the most unprepossessing appearance, does not look like a gentleman, and I don't think his name would be in the stud book. We get on very well with the French, but they want everything and do as little as possible. It was a great pity the French Admiralty did not leave Pratt here in command." The question remains, to what degree was Pratt compromised? There is little doubt that amongst French officers he was bitterly criticised for his over-familiarity with the British and his failure to represent French interests, having lost any sense of independence. Commodore Edmond Delage, teacher at the French Naval Academy, recorded that he was, quote, "the most obliging collaborator." Indeed, Pratt was confronted by Admiral Docteur, who, whilst recognising Pratt's collusion with the British in keeping information from La Perriere, stated, "I am wondering if you have not become a British admiral." Pratt was alone among the French in his view that at the Dardanelles all was well between allies. He wrote, "For the first time in history, two naval squadrons are totally integrated in what he called Allied forces." Furthermore, he never expressed any reservations about anything the British were doing. French officers regarded Pratt, as they did Robeck, as incompetent and careless with the lives of his men. Indeed, glory and honour appear high on his agenda. His message of 21st March to de Robeck following the 18th March failure confirms this view. He wrote, "My division has been placed at a splendid school of valour and devotion. Under such conditions, we had an easy role, ruling our conduct on your splendid example and that on our noble brothers in arms, the British fleet. It was enough to remain faithful to the honour and to the religion of sacrifice." It was enough to remain faithful to the honour and to the religion of sacrifice. Pratt's words indicate a strong degree of subservience in deprecation of the role of French action, particularly when one considers the loss of Gaulois and 600 men. Additionally, he did commit the cardinal sin of criticising his own men to his allies. Keyes recorded, "The French are miserable. They sent in the Marriott, a submarine, a few days ago. She has been sunk and the crew captured. Poor Milot is very unhappy. And Admiral Pratt said today that they had taken such pride in their submarine service before the war. And although they thought they were the best, we, the British, went everywhere as we liked. Our crews were splendid, and they, the French, with the best intentions, were always failing." Although Pratt was not the only French officer to make disparaging remarks about his own men, his compromised position is clear. Pratt appears to have, in modern parlance, gone native. Perhaps the degree to which Pratt had indeed become a British admiral is indicated by Keyes in a letter to his wife bemoaning that they, i.e. the French, would not leave our dear Pratt in command. It was proposed at the opening of this paper that several factors required consideration: unity of intent, interoperability, burden sharing, decision-making, communication, and equality of partnership. I think it's the case that in each and every factor there was full or partial failure at the Dardanelles. There was no unity of intent between the Allies, with both pursuing diverse and antagonistic grand strategy policies, but there were major issues at the operational level too. In 1915, it would be unexpected that these allies would have full interoperability. After all, NATO has shown us it takes decades to get anything close to that. Despite evidence that exchanges were made at staff level, and in a matter of despite that evidence that exchanges were made at staff level, and in the matter of signals, it appears to have been relatively superficial. And many French officers took the view that the British had no interest in interoperability at all. In the matter of burden sharing, it is also clear that there was considerable friction on this point. The British were strongly of the view that the French were not up to the job, and to make matters worse, attempted to take on as many jobs as possible, despite having the means, or rather not having the means to do so. However, it was undoubtedly the issue of command and control that caused the greatest friction. The British believed they simply did not need the French. That and their undoubted sense of superiority meant that they took decisions without including their ally, and to compound matters failed to communicate operational decisions effectively or at all. In this regard, there was absolutely no equality of partnership, a breach that the French felt very deeply. However, these failures of command and control could have been mitigated or eliminated altogether had a different French admiral been in post from the start. Pratt, as a French admiral first and foremost, failed. He failed his own squadron, and he failed his country. A stronger personality like Nicole might have probably provided a challenge to the dominance of the Royal Navy, but instead Pratt went native, obligingly following whatever the British did, regardless of the damage to French interests, ships and men. In conclusion, the naval operation at the Dardanelles, or at least the naval aspect of it, was undermined by the fact that all elements of successful combined naval operations, as defined by Ellerman and Payne, were absent. But perhaps we expect too much. The men on the spot were men of their time. While modern concepts of shared sovereignty and national subordination were alien to them, whilst 19th century concepts so absent today, such as honour, personal and national, dominated their thinking. But finally, to go back to the question at the beginning of the paper, new friends, old enemies, eternal rivals, I would have to say that at the conclusion of our research together, both British and French, our greatest surprise was that we were not surprised. We are eternal rivals. Thank you very much indeed.